The PlayStation Portable was home to some seriously underrated racing experiences, and few franchises embraced it like Need for Speed. EA delivered 6 different Need for Speed games on Sony's handheld, each with its own style, strengths, and, well, flaws. Let's go through every Need for Speed game on the PSP in release order and break down what made them fast and what makes me furious. So without further ado, welcome to the weird Need for Speed PSP games. So our first of 6 is called Need for Speed Underground Rivals. It launched alongside the PSP way back in 2005 and was the first handheld exclusive Need for Speed title. It was developed by Team Fusion, who was the handheld department within EA Canada, specifically created for Need for Speed PSP titles. The game is of course a spin-off of the Need for Speed Underground games, so it's very similar in how it plays out. You have either the Underground mode, also known as Career mode, or Quick Race, so let's ignore Quick Race and focus on the Underground. The Underground mode can be broken down into various different event types. You've got your standard circuit race, which is divided into 4 classes: Master, Novice, Pro, and Car Spec. The first 3 are self-explanatory, and Car Spec allows only the compulsory set cars to take part in a particular event. You've got drag races, drift attack, which you just collect drift points for going on markers. You have a lap knockout race, which again is fairly self-explanatory. Nitrous run, which to win the race you need to get from one checkpoint to another, and as you pass through each checkpoint you get more time and more boost. There's street cross, where you will drive in a narrow indoor circuit, and rally relay, where you need more than one car so you swap into your next vehicle after each lap. Now, as this is an Underground title, there's also some pretty decent customization. A lot of visual parts, but they're mainly in body kit sets as compared to a bunch of different separate upgrades. Unlike the home console Underground games, there's no star rating system ranking your appearance, so it actually doesn't really matter that much except for your own preference. And of course there is physical performance tuning, which is the much more important of the two for this game. Each car has 10 different upgrade categories and an overall total of 46 upgrades, mixed between boost, intake and exhaust, engine, turbocharger, chassis, so on and so forth. So considering this is a PSP launch title, there's actually quite a lot of content to play your way through here. I mean, there was a hell of a lot of content in Underground 2, so I guess that does make sense. Speaking of Underground 2, the soundtrack in Rivals is exactly the same as Underground 2, except it has 6 new songs as well, including music from My Chemical Romance. Now, so far so good, right? Well, Underground Rivals does have some issues, and it's an issue that will pretty much consistently be in most of the PSP Need for Speed games, and that is the AI. The AI in Underground Rivals are pretty stupid, sometimes driving off the track into trees and walls, although incredibly I would say they've been dumber in later titles in the series, so I mean that's impressive from the dev team. Visually I think the game looks pretty good, the car models are pretty decent, the customization does look nice, and the tracks themselves are pretty passable, especially for a 2005 launch title. The game would go on to review fairly decently with a 74 out of 100 Metascore, as well as a 7.3 out of 10 user score, so pretty much everyone was in agreement here. The game would also go on to have a pretty impressive sales figure, with 1.3 million copies sold. These stats are from VG Charts. The game would later go on to the digital store so you could play it backwards compatible on the PS Vita as well. Anyway, that's a pretty strong start for Need for Speed on the PSP. Let's see if it keeps that momentum. Now before we find out, if you're a fan of racing games, PSP, Need for Speed, then why not hit that subscribe button and tap the bell for notifications for my future uploads. And whilst you're at it, if you want to be the first to hear about my upcoming videos, or if you just want to come and chat about a bunch of old cool games, then join my Discord server using the link in the description below. Anyway, that's enough plugging the channel. Let's see if our next entry kept that momentum going. So this is Need for Speed Most Wanted 510, once again brought to you by Team Fusion, and of course published by EA. 510 actually also released in 2005, so we got 2 Need for Speed PSP titles in 1 year. 510 is of course a spin-off of the home console version of Need for Speed Most Wanted. Now interestingly, I have devoted a whole video to 510 in my worst racing game series, so it's safe to say I'm not the biggest fan of this game. The handling is a lot more janky than it was in Underground Rivals, the collision detection is not great, and they introduced a game mode that involved you taking down other cars, so when you have collision detection that doesn't work, it's kinda pointless. They tried to do something like Burnout and it just did not work whatsoever. The tracks are all quite dull, although the visuals themselves are an improvement from Underground Rivals, with the car models looking significantly better, which is pretty impressive considering this game still released in the same year. Like Underground Rivals, it features a few different kinds of races, such as your standard circuit race, a sprint race which is just checkpoint to checkpoint, lap knockout, time trial, and a mode called Tuner Takedown, where you get to play as a police officer and you have to take out as many street racers as you can to get more time and get a higher score. And this would be the coolest part of the game in practice if it were not for the terrible collision detection. But when you're not playing as the police, they somehow become absolute superhumans. The police in this game ignore every other street racer in your race except you, and they will hunt you down relentlessly with some of the most ridiculous rubber banding I've ever seen. They'll be driving really simplistic, quite slow looking cars, and magically they'll just shoot off towards you at like 200 miles per hour. Do they slow down on the bends during this? No, they just stick to it like a Skeletrix car. Don't get me wrong, there is some fun to be had here, and there's still some decent customization, and a fair bit of content with more than 75 different events in the game. But it's a lot more janky, it's a lot more unpredictable, and the handling is all over the place. So if you're going to play a Need for Speed title, probably don't make it this one on the PSP. Weirdly, the game would still go on to review pretty well with a 72 out of 100 average score on Metacritic. The game also holds a 7.4 out of 10, so again, very similar in terms of critic and user scores. The game would also go on to sell even better than Underground Rivals, with over 2 million copies of Most Wanted 510 sold. If you're a fan of this game, then fair enough, but I just don't think 510 is for me whatsoever. So finally moving away from 2005, we are now in 2006, and Team Fusion bought us Need for Speed Carbon Own the City, of course a spin-off of Need for Speed Carbon. There were a few different versions of Own the City, with one being on DS, one on Game Boy Advance, and then of course this version on the PSP, which, let's face it, is the superior version. So whilst 510 was a definite bump in the road for me, Own the City was a big step in the right direction. The visuals were better, the handling was better, there was free roam, the tracks were better, just overall a much more entertaining game. And Carbon Own the City has an absolutely insane story, which sees you and your brother getting into a crash at the start of the game, with your brother passing away and you entering a coma and losing your memory. Anyway, things play out and you try and work your way through to find out who caused the crash that killed your brother. Well, it turns out, and spoiler warning here, it was you. Absolutely insane stuff going on in that game. Genuinely blew my mind. Now, Own the City is actually the other Need for Speed game in this video that I have already dedicated a whole video to, so if you want to hear more about my positive opinion on that game, go check out my video on Carbon Own the City. Now, interestingly, this game has its own fictional map called Coast City, although it's pretty much entirely a carbon copy of Rockport from the home console version of Need for Speed Most Wanted. Now, in terms of gameplay options, a lot of the races are very similar to previous entries in the series, but it is the first handheld Need for Speed game to feature free roam police pursuits, as well as having free roam in general. Now, in terms of critical response, Need for Speed Carbon Own the City holds a 73 out of 100 on Metacritic. As you can see, a lot of these scores are very similar, so it is really down to your own preference which of these you enjoy more. However, the user score for this game is a little bit higher, with a 7.7 out of 10. And again, this game would go on to top the sales figures from the previous 2 entries, with 2.4 million copies sold, which is very impressive. So Carbon Own the City was once again a big step in the right direction for the Need for Speed PSP series, so let's see if that momentum continues. So 2007 came along and gave us Need for Speed ProStreet on everything except the PSP, where this would get a release in February of 2008. It didn't have a subtitle this time, it's just called Need for Speed ProStreet, but for the PSP. This was the final Need for Speed game developed by the handheld division at EA Canada, Team Fusion. So with ProStreet, EA steered the franchise towards a more realistic approach, and on the PSP this translated into a more grounded and track-based experience. Visually, this was the most impressive Need for Speed game on PSP yet, and I would say it still holds up today. So the meat and potatoes of ProStreet is the career mode, and there are a few different difficulties that you can play under which are called driver personas. So you have full assist, also known as the weekend warrior, where you get much more assisted driving but less rewards at the end. Then you have the semi-assist, which is the adrenaline junkie, where you only get a 25% reduction and still some assistance. Or you can have no assist, also known as the speed king, where you get full driver rating points and cash prizes and no assistance at all, which is 100% the best way to play. There are a variety of different event types such as standard circuit racing, lap knockout racing, and then time attack, speed trap, which was quite interesting. You compete against other racers and go through a range of different speed traps to set the highest total speed. There's a gate knockout, which is basically like lap knockout but shorter, and then sprint racing, which is just a point-to-point race. The incredible customization from previous Need for Speed titles is once again in this game, with both visual and performance level upgrades. One thing that is good about earlier Need for Speed titles is they really get you to invest in just one car or a couple of cars as you progress. That feeling isn't really here so much in ProStreet because certain events require certain classes of cars, and they just hand you some cars as you progress on through. So it's not like you just buy one Volkswagen Golf or Ford Fiesta and just street race that for the rest of time. You have a variety of different cars that get a lot faster as you progress through the game. They also introduced damage in this game, so if you hit too many opponents or crashed into too many walls, your car would start to see some major performance issues, and if you wanted to repair it, well, you had to repair it, then it would be taken from whatever you earned at the end of the race. Gone is the street racing and free roam of previous Need for Speed titles. Here we have track-based real-world locations, primarily taking tracks from America such as Texas World Speedway and Portland International Raceway. However, there were a couple of tracks from Japan, a few from Germany, and then one from Ireland. The game also introduced a mechanic called Driver Intuition, which was essentially an optional racing line. In the two difficulties that still had some assistance, the racing line would automatically be put on just on corners, but if you were playing on the no assist difficulty, then the only way you'd get that driving line is if you activate it. And there are some benefits to using it because if you do drive along the driving line, then you do get an acceleration boost. But you know, who needs a driving line? I definitely know what I'm doing. The PSP version of ProStreet shares the same original soundtrack as the home console version, so there was an original score composed by Junkie XL, but there was also a range of licensed songs from bands such as Avenged Sevenfold. This version also allowed you to add your own tracks in if you had any MP3 files stored on your PSP, although you could only play them on the menus and not in the races. Now, across the board, Need for Speed ProStreet was not the best reviewing game in the series. In fact, it took a little bit of a dive even in its home console versions in terms of its overall review scores. Home console versions of the game were averaging between about 60 to 70, and the PSP version actually only scored 57 out of 100. I was actually quite surprised by this because I had quite a good time playing it. I thought the handling was pretty decent, the visuals were nice, but then again, it did kind of move away from the standard Need for Speed formula at the time, and that wasn't for everyone. Again, that's just my opinion. If you're not a fan of this game, fair enough. These lower review scores would also reflect in the game's sales figures, because the PSP version of this game sold just shy of 800,000 copies, which is significantly less than its predecessors. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, then simply just comment the word speed down below. Now, whilst ProStreet PSP may not have been for everyone, The next entry, at least for me, is where the PSP Need for Speed series grinds to a halt, and that is Need for Speed Undercover. Once again, 2008 was a year that had 2 Need for Speed PSP releases, with this one releasing in November of that year. As the name would suggest, you are playing an undercover cop trying to investigate a series of crime lords. To investigate further, you need to earn more respect from street racing, and that's exactly what the game is. But that's all the game is. So, as I mentioned, ProStreet PSP was the last game in the series to be developed by Team Fusion. Undercover PSP was brought to you by the developers behind Die Hard Nakatomi Plaza, and that is Piranha Games. You may also know them for the Mech Warrior series. Anyway, Undercover for me was a big downgrade for the PSP series. Yes, it did go back in the street racing direction, which was cool, but those streets look horrible. The environments do not look good. The car models themselves, yeah, they're still pretty good, but the actual game to me just looks quite ugly. The handling is okay, there's still a decent amount of customization and a decent amount of gameplay modes. You've got standard lap-based races, checkpoint races, sprint races, cop takeouts where you have to immobilize police vehicles. There's escape, which is exactly what it says on the tin, escape a police pursuit. There is still quite a lot going on here, but it just feels incredibly average and doesn't look that great. I mean, hey, at least the cutscenes are kind of entertaining.
Looks like you've met Hector Mayo. Good. He has a small ring of car thieves in the area.
Not bad at all, homeboy.
Now again, across the board, review scores for this game would not be that great. In fact, they were even lower than ProStreet. Most versions of the game sat between about 55 and 60, with the PSP version being below that with 52 out of 100 on Metacritic. Again, these reviews would translate to about the same level of sales as ProStreet, with just under 800,000 copies sold. Now I wonder, will the series make a little recovery for the final game on the PSP? So just under a year later, in September of 2009, along came Need for Speed Shift. So after the response to ProStreet trying to go more realistic wasn't that great, they tried to go back to street racing with Undercover, where the response also wasn't that great, so the next logical step was to just make it even more realistic with Need for Speed Shift. And you know what? It kind of paid off. The PSP version of Shift was brought to you by EA Brightlight, or also used to be known as EA UK. This development team were responsible for a variety of different games, such as every single Harry Potter movie tie-in game all the way up until the Deathly Hallows, as well as Burnout Dominator, and some board game video game adaptations such as Monopoly and Trivial Pursuit. Anyway, so Shift on the PSP presents itself in a more realistic way, as does every other version of the game, except every other version of the game does feel more realistic. This still kinda has the same handling as all the previous Need for Speed games on the PSP. And that's not really a problem, it still works pretty well, it just doesn't have the same feel as the console version. The car models all still look really good, the environment itself looks a lot better than it did in the previous entry, and overall this is just a much more solid game. Need for Speed Shift came at a time where there were talks of just cancelling the Need for Speed franchise entirely. After a couple of rough entries, the series needed a nice little adrenaline boost, and thankfully this was the right step. Which seems oddly familiar to the situation we find ourselves in present day with Need for Speed. Except there hasn't been an adrenaline boost for the series again, and if rumours are true, it sounds like the series has currently been shelved. Anyway, once again, this game will take you through a pretty impressive career mode with a variety of different event types. Standard circuit racing, there's car battle where 2 drivers compete with specific cars in 3 different race events, there's drift racing, endurance racing, lap knockout, time attack, there's quite a lot going on here. Now, there are less visual upgrades in this game compared to previous entries in the series, but on the other hand there are more performance upgrades as well. I spent a lot of time with Need for Speed Shift on the Xbox 360 when I was younger, and I thought maybe that would make my experience here on the PSP less enjoyable, but I still had a pretty good time playing this. Thankfully, review scores for this game were up from the previous 2 entries in the series, with the PS3 and 360 versions sitting at 83 and 84, and the PSP version sitting at a 69 out of 100, so significantly higher than the previous two. Now, these higher review scores would really translate into the sales figures, at least for the home console versions, with the Xbox version selling just under 2 million copies, and the PS3 version selling just under 2.5 million. However, the PSP version was actually still sitting around the 700,000 to 800,000 mark. I think that whilst the console versions of Need for Speed do tend to feel quite different from each other, the handling in most of the Need for Speed PSP games is nearly identical to each of the previous. Sure, the vibes might be different, the music might be different, but if you leave it at the core gameplay experience, each one does feel quite similar. So, which PSP Need for Speed game is the best? Well, that depends on what you're after. Whilst handling may be similar in each title, each game does have a very distinct feel to it, a completely different vibe. Each one took a different route, and while none were perfect, they made the PSP an underrated home for the series. So which one is your favourite? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you want to see any other series covered for the PSP, let me know as well. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap the bell for notifications of my future uploads. Until then, I will see you in my next video. Bye bye.